Well, every month I usually give you about 8 or 9 book reviews. Only 5 this month. So what should I call this month? Slacker September, unsatisfactory number of books September. I don't know, whatever it is, here are the reviews of the 5 books that I read this September. Hey everyone, and welcome to my September book reviews. I'm going to share with you short reviews and ratings for the 5 books that I read this month. It is a low total. It's my lowest total in years. School was a little busier for me this month. Some of these books took a bit longer than I thought they would. It was still a pretty solid month though, because of these 5 books, 3 of them did get 5-star ratings from me. So didn't quite get the quantity that I normally get this month, but I did get the quality. So with all of these monthly wrap-ups, I always group these reviews by genre. So if you want to skip a certain genre or skip to a certain genre, there are chapters below, so feel free to do that. Normally I have the book of the month last, but I couldn't quite do that for reasons that you'll find out. But it is in the science fiction section of this video, and it's one for the ages, honestly. But let's go ahead and get started with a book that I already did a full review on. So if you want further thoughts on this one, I read Holly by Stephen King, and Holly was a work of crime fiction, and a straightforward work of crime fiction. This wasn't one with supernatural elements like some of the other Holly stories. And I already did a full review of this one. A lot of you did watch that one, so I'm glad that you did check that one out. If you don't know, on YouTube, individual book reviews don't get as many views as a lot of other videos, and this one did better than I thought. So thank you, those of you that have seen it already. If you haven't already, I will link it below and probably link it up here as well. But overall, I felt that it had some issues. I almost called the video The Problem with Stephen King's Holly. My biggest issue was it just really lacked suspense. We learned about the villains in the very first chapter, and there really wasn't a great cat and mouse going on between the villains and Holly. I think upon reflection, maybe because what we learn about the villains, it takes place over a period of years. So Holly's story just kind of stagnated and just kind of sat there and didn't really do much until she came face to face with the villains. And then the book was very good. This is one of those rare Stephen King books that I felt had a pretty solid ending, and I did enjoy that portion of it. But it was just unfortunate that this was a book that for me just lacked all suspense. And in talking with a lot of you in the comments section, this has been done well by King, this kind of plot device where you learn the villain early. I mean, we get that in Mr. Mercedes, but Mr. Mercedes was so suspenseful, and this one just was really lacking suspense. And I'm not sure if it's because Holly took so long to find the villains, or the villains were just kind of milquetoast villains. I really don't know why, but it just totally lacks suspense for me. And unfortunately, a crime thriller, this was a crime thriller without the thrills, although it did end well. That's all I'll say, since I already did a full review. It's about a 10-minute review if you want to go check that one out. But overall, Holly by Stephen King, just kind of a middle rating for a King book for me. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5. All right, 2 books in the fantasy genre next, starting with Mistress of the Empire by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wurts. This is the conclusion of the Empire trilogy, which was written in the 80s, and I'm so mad that I took so long to get to it because I really enjoyed all 3 of these books. This is a fantastic series that is definitely probably a top 15 of all time for me. I just did my top 10 book series video, so it'll be a few years before I update that one and have to make a decision as to where this ranks, but I really enjoyed this. And thinking about it since I finished this book, the 2 things that stick out for me that made this book so great for me were just the immersion factor and the investment factor of me as a reader. I was so invested in Mara's tale. These 3 books span really decades. I don't know if it really tells you how old she is in this book, but it talks about her gray hair. And we first met Mara in the first book, and she was 17 years old. So we get to see this character over the span of at least 20 years, and we get to see her growth, we get to see her successes, her failures, we get to see her go through some truly traumatic events, including something at the very beginning of this one that in many ways scars her and changes her in such a fundamental way. It was really interesting to me where this story went because I didn't expect it to go where it did. I figured it was still going to be this kind of game of the council that she had been playing in the 3 books, and that was still present, but there was kind of a bigger overarching thing that Mara chooses to confront in this book that made it much more interesting. This one had a lot more fantasy elements than the first 2 books. There was a lot more magic in this one, but the immersion is the other side of the thing that I loved about this. I just felt every time I was reading this, it's just one of those reads that I was just totally immersed in the story. Everything else disappeared. I was just so invested in Mara's story. She is a character that I really, really enjoyed in all 3 books, and seeing her grow over the 3 books. There's one aspect of the epilogue I didn't love. Initially, I said I was okay with it when I was talking with someone on the Grimoire about it. I said I was okay with it. Now I'm kind of more, I don't know, lukewarm about it. I think there could have been a better kind of epilogue, final conclusion to this series, but overall I do like where this series ended. I did love the journey. This is a book series that I'm so glad I finally picked up. If you like, kind of the coming of age tale that you get in the first book, if you like political intrigue, if you like seeing a character grow over the course of several books, if you like an Asian-inspired fantasy, this might be a book series that you enjoy. So I gave Mistress of the Empire, just like the other 2 books, I gave this one a 5 out of 5. The other work of fantasy that I read this month was The Inheritance by Megan Lindholm and Robin Hobb. And those are the same people, and neither of them is her real name, which I found out in the prologue. I didn't realize that. I thought her name was Megan Lindholm and Robin Hobb was a pseudonym, but both of them are pseudonyms. And it's interesting, and she talks about how she writes differently as she writes the 2 different authors. And I know King does that as well. When he writes as Bachman, he's very different. Lindholm is kind of more short fiction oriented, more to the point, a lot of lower fantasy. And Hobb takes her time. She even says that in here, how Hobb takes her time and sometimes takes a while to get to her point. But I do love the writing style of both of them because they are both superb. There were some fantastic stories in this short story collection. It was interesting, though. It's about 400 pages and about 200 pages each for each author, and Lindholm's 200 pages were 7 or 8 stories and Hobb's were 3 because Hobb takes a while. But I loved Hobb's stories set in the 6 Duchies. There's one set in the Rain Wilds that just shows what an awesome writer she is. It's a 90-page novella that has one of the best character arcs I've read anywhere. Another one of these has one of the greatest villains I've encountered in fiction in a novella. I hated the villain in the last story in this collection. This was a fantastic short story collection. Some of the Lindholm stories weren't quite as good as others, but some of them were easily, 4 or 5 stars. Overall, I would give this collection a 4.5 out of 5. You don't have to have read anything by Hobb. The ones in the 6 Duchies don't tie into the realm of the Elderlings. So if you haven't read Hobb before, this might be an easy place to start without, much of a commitment of having to read a trilogy. But I really did enjoy The Inheritance and Other Tales by Megan Lindholm and Robin Hobb. All right, and the last 2 books this month, and the reason I couldn't save the best for last is because they're in the same book series. This is Endymion and Rise of Endymion. Endymion's my book of the month, but I gave both of these 5 stars. I think the Hyperion Cantos is one of the most remarkable book series I've read because all 4 books are 100% different from one another. If you'll indulge me to talk about the first 2 a little bit, although I did do a dual review, go check that one out. Hyperion is a work of literature that's set in a science fiction setting. The Fall of Hyperion is kind of a steampunk, straightforward science fiction tale that just kind of closes that story because Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion pretty much form a duology. Well, Endymion and Rise of Endymion are also a duology. It's one story that's set about 250 years later. Endymion is pretty much an action-adventure tale. Rise of Endymion is a highly philosophical work of science fiction with a lot of ideas, but they're not thrown at you like The Fall of Hyperion, where it felt like a lot of jargon. Maybe because a lot of them you'd heard of already. And I felt that I was able to really think about the ideas that Simmons was going to portray in the conclusion of this series. But to try to talk about them in order, Endymion is an action-adventure tale. You get a character named Rawl Endymion, named after the city on the planet of Hyperion. And at the very beginning, one of the characters from the first duology gives him kind of a quest and says, you need to do this, 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 this. And everything that he asks him to do are pretty much impossible, starting with rescuing a young girl from basically millions of Pax troops in the middle of Hyperion. And it starts there and it never quits. There's some fantastic character development. There's some fantastic characters in here. I thought back when I was enjoying this one so much, why I was enjoying it, because it was just kind of an action-adventure tale. And I realized that it has my two favorite fantasy tropes, even though it's a work of science fiction. It has a quest trope and it has a fellowship trope. I talked about this actually earlier this year when I was talking about Lonesome Dove, how that's a Western, but it had my two favorite fantasy tropes. I think these are just two of my favorite tropes, period. So I really loved Endymion because we got this kind of fellowship of characters that, although it's a small group of characters, that become a unit that you really care about. And it is a quest. Rawl's given this task at the very beginning, and he has to do all of these things. But there's nothing straightforward about the storytelling in either of these books. This is easily one of the most ambitious works I've read in my lifetime, these 4 books. I would say probably his other books, Ilium and Olympus, might be slightly more ambitious, but I don't think he pulled it off in those books, but I feel he did in this one. I also don't feel that I could review these really well. Like if I wanted to do a dedicated review where I'm not talking about each of these books for like 2 minutes, I don't know how well I could explain the themes and the concepts and how it worked so well. But Endymion itself is the action-adventure tale. I loved it from beginning to end. There's kind of a cat and mouse chase going on, in addition to the quest and the journey and the fellowship that I love. Another trope that I love is I love the prescient child trope. And we have a prescient young woman here, and I love that. I love that in Dune. There was one of those in Dune. I love that when you see that where you don't know why that young person is like that, and you start to learn it throughout the 2 books. The second book, Rise of Endymion, gives you a lot more philosophy. You see, I saw people complain about the religiosity of this book because there's a lot of it in there. There's a lot of questions about humanity and evolution and faith and power struggles between so many different factions. I will say it was a little confusing at the start of this one because it embraced a lot of the philosophical things, but also embraced in the world what was going on. And they tell you right away that there's kind of 6 different sides of this conflict initially. So keeping track of things was a little challenging at first, but then a lot of them kind of consolidated, and a lot of them consolidated to simply be against Rawl and this prescient child that you meet in Endymion. What I found interesting in both books was kind of the narrative shifts between Rawl. When Rawl's telling his story, it's from, at the end of the book, he's telling this story, it's a first-person narrative. And then interspersed are chapters of third-person omniscience that is also from Rawl's perspective, and he explains it to you and explains it to you at the end, you know, how all of this came about. And I thought that broke it up really well. A lot of readers don't like first-person narratives. I don't know why, because it's something I've always enjoyed. Maybe I've just had some great ones early in my reading life that I just like that perspective, but I thought it was done very, very well here. The end of Rise of Endymion, I saw coming about 30 pages away, and it still made me cry. It was still so beautiful. I hadn't realized that I cared for these characters as much as I did. I'll be honest, I said earlier this year, maybe last year, I don't know, in a video when I was talking about science fiction series, and I said I was still looking for that science fiction series that's for me. I think I found it in Hyperion Cantos. So another one, when I redo that top 10 list, this one I'm very sure will be in that top 10 list. Where's it going to be on my sci-fi list? That list will come out soon, I hope. I've been talking about it for months. That's my next top 10 video. It's going to be really high because I loved all 4 of these Hyperion Cantos books. It's just the writing style, the ambition. He pulled it off, even if I don't feel the most eloquent at explaining what was so magnificent about these books. They were magnificent nonetheless. Endymion, 5 stars. Rise of Endymion, 5 stars. Endymion was my book of the month, September 2023. Well, that was my month, only 5 books, but I hope that you hearing me gush about the quality of the books that I read this month, even if the quantity wasn't what it normally is, makes up for it. But it was a fantastic month. I hope every month after this I can say I have 3/5 of my books are 5-star reads and I find a new favorite. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter and Goodreads. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.